All right. Well, hello from the International Association of Privacy Professionals. I am Caitlin Fennessy, Research Director here at the IAPP. And I'm here today with Dani Shapiro, author of the national bestseller Inheritance. And we were lucky enough to have you, Dani, keynote our IAPP summit in Washington, D.C. last spring. So we are just delighted to have you back here in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, as part of your national book tour, as I understand it. And Dani is speaking this evening at the Music Hall in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. So for any local privacy pros out there, hope you'll show up and come see her. But Dani, as I said, I am just incredibly honored to be the one sitting here with you. I'm in awe of your writing and of course, loved your book. And I have to share, as I just shared with you in person, that I grabbed my copy of Inheritance this morning, having just got back from a week away where my mom was helping out with my kids. And I found this note tucked inside that I just thought was so telling, so had to share it. It just says, "Loved it. Thank you, Mom." So just an awesome book. So before we kick off our discussion, I just wanted to ask for your help setting the stage with regard to the book. As you know, as you've talked to our audience, the IAPP membership is largely made up of privacy professionals who are tuning into our conversation, working in all areas of privacy. For those who have not yet had the pleasure of reading your book, can you help us set the stage, give us the elevator pitch, what this is all about, what brings you here?
Yeah, absolutely. And before I do that, let me just say that Inheritance in hardcover was published a year ago. It comes out tomorrow in paperback, which is why I'm back on the road on tour. But in this year, I've been on tour pretty much full stop, all the time, more than 100 events. And I've noticed over the course of this year that increasingly some of the questions during the Q&A sessions more and more have to do with privacy and with questions about privacy. So, elevator pitch. In the winter of 2016, my husband was sending away for a DNA kit, as I think of it, recreationally, just for fun, to see maybe if there were some distant relatives that he didn't know about, so that he'd be able to speak to his elderly dad about that kind of thing. And he asked me if I wanted to do it too. And I had absolutely no interest. I wasn't curious. I knew where I came from. I knew everything about my family that there was to know. But something made me sort of just shrug and say, sure. As I'm sure you all know, these companies lower their prices right before the holidays, make it very appealing, make it be like no big deal. It's just fun. And so a couple of months later, when my results were returned, in short order, they revealed to me that my dad, who had passed away when I was young and who I had been very close to, had not been my biological father. And that led me, without giving everything away, but down this rabbit hole into a big part of the world that I think that interests privacy professionals resides, which is that I came to discover that my parents had had fertility issues, that they had gone to an institute that used donor sperm, anonymous donors, and that my biological father was an anonymous sperm donor, who I found within 36 hours of discovering that my dad had not been my biological father. And that has plunged me since then into this world of questions and bioethics and all of the issues, I'm sure some of which we're going to talk about, in terms of what is our responsibility to each other in this world where science has changed everything, all the rules, I was going to say. But the rules are changing because of these unintended consequences of this combination, I think, of the 1-2 punch of easy, accessible, inexpensive DNA testing that has become the number one holiday gift in America, and the internet, which makes everything figure-outable and discoverable.
Thank you so much. I think for privacy professionals, your writing in this topic is so intriguing, in part because it's so personal, right? You make these issues that sometimes are the subject of lengthy privacy notices so real and so personal. So yes, let's talk about some of those issues. So in your book, you write about privacy, and sometimes you even touch specifically on that. More often, I think you spoke of secrets and surprise. And so every time you said the word surprise, it made me think about expectations. And I think in the privacy world, we think about meeting or setting user expectations and how to avoid shocking surprises. When you did this, you speak of it as a bit of a whim, but presumably there were some kind of terms of service. Um, I would love to hear your thoughts on how prepared you felt for the information that you were given about your own genetics, and if you had any concerns about how your data, might be used without you knowing.
Well, to start with, I am certain, I mean, I know for a fact that there are these terms of use, very tiny, or at least that, as I recall, you check the box, you can barely even see what you're signing away, or what you're, either what rights are you signing away or what you might be letting yourself in for. The marketing of of these particular companies, DNA testing companies, is really all about, Ancestry.com. It's Kelly Ripa waving the Italian flag, saying, "I just found out I'm a one eighth Italian." It's all good fun. It's all, fun facts, and very little is made of the approximately 2% of people who take these tests, like in the way that I did, unsuspectingly, and discover what in that world is known as an NPE, which stands for not parent expected. So um, there was no part of me that was prepared for that, partly because I had no suspicion that that was the case. I think today people are becoming a little bit more aware, partly because of my book and partly because of a lot of news stories, that this is kind of epidemic with how many people are discovering things about their things that were not, that they hadn't signed on for, that they had no idea. It's not always not parent expected. Sometimes it's not child expected.
Mm.
Sometimes it's not half siblings expected. It's lots of different kinds of discoveries, but they're all happening. And in my experience, as the person who I think has probably met more of these people than I would say anyone, because they all come to my events and in my book tours, um, there is a sense of people aren't taking these tests because they think they're going to find out that kind of thing. They're taking these tests because, in the same way that I did, for the most part, and making these discoveries. In terms of privacy, I honestly didn't think about it. I think I would today, 4 years later, because again, it's much more understood, that how many doors and windows and pathways our DNA um, can lead to, and the question of what happens to it, um, and who can see it, and what's that going to mean, and has that horse fled the barn, or is there still anything to do about it?
I, you're speaking to that makes me wonder if some of these issues are too big to prepare yourself for, or if I guess the question is, do you think there would have been a way, or there is a way to kind of prepare the users for these types of surprises or privacy issues?
I don't think anybody thinks that it's going to be them.
Yeah.
Um, After I speak now, people either say, "I'm never taking one of those tests," or they immediately order one of those tests, or they reset their privacy function in the tests that they've already done.
Uh,
People have different responses based on their own conscience. I mean, I have someone, a friend of mine, who said, "I think that probably my father wasn't my biological father, and I'm never going to take one of those tests because Um, it's a family business.
Yeah.
The family has a business, and he would be terrified of what would happen if it got out that that was the case. But for the most part, most of the people making these discoveries aren't. They're just, I mean, in retrospect, when I think of my story, it was, in the light of retrospect, very clear that in all likelihood my father wasn't my biological father. But there's a term um, that I came across in my research as I was writing the book, and it's a psychoanalytic term, and it's the unthought known.
Mm.
What we know in our bones, in our sinew, in our marrow, in our gut, but it's too dangerous to think, so we don't think it. And I find that such a powerful, painful, poetic, human. I think we all have elements of it, and it's a question of how much or how big. And in my case, the unthought known, I mean, even as a writer, when I go back and I read my early work, when I was a 25-year-old baby writer, it's there in my work. I knew, but I couldn't think it. So when I went ahead and said, sure, I'll spit into the plastic vial, it was with nothing in my body was saying, uh-oh. And I think that that's really true for most people. And which is why I don't have the latest statistics about this at my fingertips, but I heard maybe 6 months ago that that 23andMe was fielding between 4,000 and 6,000 phone calls a week from people saying, like, I don't understand my results. And they're training more people to answer the phone lines and have a little bit, but they're also really trying to keep it really um, out of the public sphere as much as they possibly can. The CEO of 23andMe was asked on a podcast, I was on Freakonomics, if she had read my book or heard of my books, and she said no. And I know that there's no way that's true.
Wow.
Yeah, she's like, of what are you speaking? This book, and actually, as far as I'm concerned, it's kind of a mistake on their part because I have a good story. It was a painful and shocking story, but it was a good story. I loved my dad. I still, he's my dad, and I met my biological father, and he's a really good guy who's not my dad, but who I come from. Everybody's been kind. Everybody's been good. Everyone has embraced everybody else. It doesn't get better than this. So, like, if you were ever gonna say this is the kind of thing that can happen
Mm.
as an unintended consequence, I'm a good story. I hear so many bad stories, painful stories.
So I want to turn to your dad. It's helpful to understand how you think about your privacy and your own genetics, but kind of turning to him, and you speak to this in the book. You speak about your search for him and your outreach to him.
Oh, you mean my biological father?
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Your biological father. So can you share with us how you think about your biological father's privacy?
Yeah.
Either
Yes.
where you began with that or where you ended up with that.
Yes. Let's start with where I began.
Okay.
When I first discovered my biological father, which took very few keystrokes and a hunch, an educated guess, I first saw him on a YouTube video giving a lecture. And it was unmistakable that he was my biological father. He gestured the way I'm gesturing right now. Within hours, I had written to him. And I don't know how I knew to do this, but I was able to put myself in his shoes. I have heard stories since then of people who make this discovery, and in their shock or their sense of betrayal or their rage, they'll send a registered letter, or a half a dozen newly discovered half-siblings will write a letter together, or not thinking about what it's going to be this elderly person on the other end of that, who's opening his email and thinking that he's going to, have his golf club, dues to pay, and some political contributions to make, and instead there's an email saying, I think maybe you're my biological father. I was very aware of how shocking that might be. And so I wrote a very careful letter, and I don't know that I used privacy as a word in that first letter, but it came up very quickly between us when we started um, exchanging emails. I was aware that this could potentially be upending somebody's life. Um, as it turns out, and when he wrote back to me the first time, which I also was very conscious that he didn't have to do. He could have ghosted me. He could have gaslit me. He could have said, I have no idea what you're talking about. I was never a sperm donor. You're out of your mind. Please don't contact me again. He could have done what one young woman came up to me at an event and said she found her biological father and she got 2 words back from him, not interested. Right. So I was aware that he was kind in replying to me at all, and in making it clear that I wasn't barking up the wrong tree. He spoke of living a quiet life with his family, his children and grandchildren living nearby, living in a retirement community. I mean, if you parsed what he was saying, it really was leave us alone, or don't don't intrude, don't upend my really lovely life that I've built for myself over all of these years. Um, but then he also looked me up, and the good news, because I've seen many people in this situation, donors or other members of a family who are contacted by someone who has discovered that they are related,
Mm.
and universally, the response of the family is to feel threatened. I think it's hardwired. I think it's a primitive, primal kind of what do you want? And it's usually um, you're looking for money. It kind of just goes straight to the financial because I think that's where people feel most easily, like feel it most easily
Vulnerable.
vulnerable. And I think I intuited all that. But so when he went on my website, I think he saw that had a successful career and a contented life, and you could glean a lot from my website. But it also showed that I was a writer.
Mm.
It showed a picture at that time on the homepage of my website of Oprah with her arm around me, which is like good news and bad news in this situation. And I think he was terrified that he was going to be somehow revealed.
Yeah.
And so as we progressed, and another reason why I say that our story is such a good story is that I think everyone tried to do the right thing by each other. I really wanted to respect his privacy. I also really wanted to write a book. And I had to find a way to not make those two things, uh, you know, mutually exclusive or impossible or in conflict with each other. And so I took great pains while I was researching, reporting, writing inheritance to protect his privacy. It wasn't just changing his names. There are a lot of details in the book, minor details, that change his identity enough that I didn't want anyone who knew him to be able to read the book and say, that sounds an awful lot like Ben Walden. I didn't want that to me at that level. Like, gosh, I wonder if that could be Ben Walden. I then, when I finished the book, sent it to him for his input. I wanted him to feel that his privacy was protected. And as a memoirist, it is like Memoirist 101 that you do not send a manuscript to people that you've written about. It's like sending them like a hunk of wet clay and going, here, like, would you like to reshape this? But I got his blessing, and he did feel like his privacy was protected. But in terms of how my thinking about this has evolved, we're living in this time that no one could have imagined. The promises, I don't have a lot of patience for the promises of anonymity that were given to people at a time when the idea that there could be these kinds of discoveries would have been the stuff of science fiction. It was never going to happen, right? And when I encounter people who I was at dinner just the other night with a woman who just folded her arms and she said, I know 2 families who have been ruined by being contacted by donor offspring. And I just don't believe in that. She also said to me, and your father's still your father. I was like, thank you. Have you walked for a second in my shoes? Just wondering. and I do feel that the father who raised me is still my father,
Yeah.
but I had to get there, right? It wasn't like that. Um, Regarding the contact, what I said to her was, the children or the grown children who discover this, um, they didn't ask to be conceived this way. They didn't ask to live a life where their identities were hidden from them, where they were giving incorrect medical information for their whole lives, where there was something about them that didn't add up and that didn't make sense and that just felt like something isn't quite right. And then they didn't ask to make a sort of seismic, world rocking discovery when it comes to identity at some point well into their lives. They didn't ask for any of that. And so they're walking around kind of reeling. Donors, I mean, I see this at my events all the time now. From the first night I saw it, um, not when I speak at something like the IAPP, but when I'm doing an event where people are coming from all over the place, I would see elderly men, and I would think, sperm donors. And then I would see all of these other people who looked literally like they were radiating like hunger and intensity and pain. And it was like, you just found out. And then there would be couples sitting there looking kind of stricken. And I found out very often that they were parents who had never disclosed to their children, who were trying to figure out, and this is heartbreaking to me, but this is happening all the time now. They're realizing that their children are going to find out. And they always plan to go to the grave with the secret. Are they going to do that? Or are they going to do what I would think of as the last great act of parenting that they can do and have an incredibly painful, difficult reckoning with their kids, but tell them the truth? So I'm getting a little off the subject of privacy here, but it feels to me like the rules that would seem simple don't necessarily apply. There's a lot of gray area and there's a lot of subtlety. I mean, I have a relationship with my biological father. I respected his privacy. He's been very kind to me. We like each other. What if I had been one of 47? I guarantee you we wouldn't have this relationship. What does it mean to, and that happens all the time.
Yeah.
It's happening constantly.
I actually, you say these aren't privacy issues necessarily, but actually, where I wanted to go with this conversation is touching on many of the things that you've now raised and the different groups that you've outlined, as being there and how you think about the impact and the privacy implications for each of them. So, you touched on sperm donors and you touched on adoptions. I think obviously the prevailing wisdom 50 years ago was that anonymity was possible, and it was possible with sperm donation, it was possible with adoption, it was possible with affairs. And so, you wrote in your book at some point, I think someone told you or said to you, there are no more secrets. And I'd love to get your thoughts, if you have any kind of further thoughts on that issue and how that changes the nature of privacy in society. Have we lost something if choices made sometimes at a very young age cannot be forgotten, and the reinvention that maybe was possible when they could be is not possible today. And it strays a little from privacy, but for that
It's
group.
so complex, right? Because in the case of sperm donation or egg donation, I had an interesting conversation at Harvard not that long ago where one of the bioethicists was saying that they don't feel that the donor has any responsibility at all to offspring. I mean,
Mm.
every responsibility to be in contact, responsibility to say, I see you, you exist, responsibility to supply medical information. And I said, that's so interesting. So here's another scenario. Um, a man and a woman have a one night stand. They don't know each other. They're strangers.
Yeah.
They have sex. She goes off. She's pregnant. She has the child. Um, it's 25 years later, and that child contacts that man, finds him through DNA. Does that man have any responsibility to that child? And this bioethics student said, yes, I think he does. I said, well, that's really interesting because he was not trying to procreate that night in the back of that car or whatever. Donors are.
Right.
They're not trying to have their own offspring, but they are aware that if all things go well, that is in fact what they are doing, what they're being paid to do. So it's interesting to sort of separate out completely the idea of, I mean, I think our thinking has evolved and has continued to evolve. I mean, it wasn't just that anonymity was possible back then, it was that it was desirable, it was that it was considered for the good of the child.
Mm.
The idea that what we don't know doesn't hurt us was prevalent. So, so there are all of these different kinds of um, questions and issues. There's something further I wanted to say about that. What was it? That had to do with like the now. Um, you all probably know this, but both France and I think Spain have. I know France just voted like this week that there be no more anonymity in donation. That anonymous donation is now not legal. Um, we're now at a time where it would seem to me, and one of the reasons why I continue to want to talk about all this is where you have, I mean, there's the question of there's the question of privacy, but we precede the question of privacy with the question of secrecy and non-disclosure. So let's take a situation in which um, everybody does to what my mind is the right thing, which most families today are doing. Not all. There are still, I have people coming up to me regularly saying, my teenage son doesn't know, or
Mm.
I just had a baby using a donor egg, but I gave birth, so what difference does it make? Like lots of stuff like that. And I was like, all I say is, they're going to find out. They're going to find out. They're going
Right.
to find out. That's all I can say. I don't want to like ascribe any moral anything to it. They're going to find
Yeah.
out. But for the most part, people are disclosing and then also have an awareness that um, in some cases the donor becomes part of the family system. Everybody knows. There's a sense in the larger extended family that this is the way that this child was conceived. And so, in those situations, and I'm talking about family systems, not like DNA to solve crimes and things like that, but in family systems, then that sort of starts to mitigate the questions of privacy because everybody's kind of on the same page about this. The, I would say, the intersection of privacy and secrecy here is when some people want to keep something a secret and then they don't get to and because it's not private. And I mean, I think we can pretty much safely say, or I think secrets are toxic. I think, Carl Jung once said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. I
Mm.
think we would like to be conscious of the things that are directing our life and not have it be based on secrecy. But privacy is important. And how do we live in this time where there are secrets pouring out, and yet at the same time, they they impact the privacy of individuals and um,
So I think in part, perhaps you've answered this question, but it would be interesting to me to understand if transparency and openness is your answer or not. Your genes are perhaps the most intimate thing about you, um, but they can be inferred, as was the case with your biological father, even if you don't take these tests. Um, as we begin to think about giving people agency over their own genetic data and their own genes, is openness and transparency the answer, or is there something else we can do to provide that agency?
I would love to think that there's something else that we can do. What would that be? I mean, that's
Yeah.
the. Um, I do think that openness and transparency is the first step, but it's probably not the last step. It's probably not the only step. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. No, and I mean, I feel like it's a issue that you raised other issues beyond this realm, whether it's, um, solving crimes or the like. Your data is out there, pretty publicly now, and so I
Which
think a
many,
lot of
many
people are
people don't
grappling with.
understand that yet.
Yeah.
And that's interesting too. I mean, the number of sophisticated, educated people who come up to me and say, well, I'm never taking that test because I don't want my information out there. And they don't understand that their information is already out there.
Right.
Um,
If their third cousin took it,
that's
they're
right. But
findable.
really, I would say that in my experience and in my travels for the last few years, I mean, or for the last year, that feels like a few years, that it's that many, many people are operating under kind of misapprehensions, misunderstanding about what that is.
So I guess kind of thinking back to the, maybe we can't solve this agency problem here, but having lived through this experience yourself now, are there any tools or resources that you think would have made your path easier that you would like to see out there to help other people
Oh,
in these situations?
yeah. And some of them I think are starting to be developed, but I would begin in, I mean, in the world of DNA testing with much greater transparency and support on the part of the companies who are doing this testing, and an awareness of the um, of these unintended consequences and how many hundreds of thousands of people are being affected by this, and to not be trying to sweep it under the rug,
Mm,
to actually be. I've yet to see any of these companies do anything other than try to kind of minimize that and maximize all the other, marvelous and fun things that they're doing. Important medical data, but also like, that's not how they market it. It's all fun facts.
yeah.
Um, there are more people going into um, sort of dual fields of bioethics and psychology,
Hmm.
because there's just such a it's never the effects of the secrecy, um, both of late discovery adoptees and donor conceived people, have never been studied. And the reason they've never been studied is because it was a secret. So now there's just starting to be um, a little bit of data and surveys and um, making a discovery like this is initially a very self-alienating feeling. Like, this person who I thought I was, I'm not made up of who I thought I was. Um, it's very different, and I really like to make this distinction. It's very different from growing up adopted and
Mm,
always knowing
yeah.
that you're adopted, because our identities are formed by the stories that we're told from the time we're very small. And our narratives are created out of what we're told, and our identities are built that way. And if someone is adopted and they know they're adopted, then they know why they don't resemble their biological their social parents. They can account for their feeling of otherness. They can supply reasons for this beautiful term that I write about in Inheritance, genealogical bewilderment. There's like there's they know why they're feeling what they're feeling, but the world of people whose identities are withheld from them, which includes some adoptees, fewer and fewer,
Mm,
but many donor conceived people, they were deceived. There was a huge omission. I mean, it's more than omission. I mean, they were the stories that we were told from the time we were very small were simply not true. So you're building your identity around something that's not solid, and there are literally hundreds of thousands of people who need some sort of help. I mean, they're turning to my book. I mean, that's the only help there is out there. It's people are reading Inheritance, and parents are telling their children, or the donor conceived people are feeling less alienated from themselves. But I think anything that can, I mean, in bioethics programs, this is a huge field of study. I think it's going to keep bioethicists, psychologists, sociologists, and honestly, attorneys too, busy, for the next couple of decades until it's over. And it will be over. This particular thing will be over because the world of people who had this kind of secret regarding identity kept from them, that's coming to an end because it has to. It has to, not because it's bad or wrong. It has to because it's all coming out. So I really think 20, 25 years from now, the idea that there were ever these kinds of secrets is just going to be like, what do you mean? That's so crazy. Why would anybody do that?
It's interesting you say that, I think in part because I think the broader privacy field is kind of going down the line of privacy ethics and realizing that kind of the notice, the tick box consent that you described at the
Yeah.
beginning is just not doing enough, and we need to think about ethics and trust. And I think maybe with that, I will thank you so much for joining us here. This
My pleasure.
was incredible. Really appreciate your time and wish you luck at the music hall tonight. I'm sure it will be wonderful.
Thank you.
So thank you, and thank you to all of you.
Thanks.